With Hashem's loving grace, welcome to the story of Passover. This is our first lesson of the three parts. Is about slavery in Egypt. Now, in a preface that the Holy Zohar calls matzah, bread we don't matzah is called lachman be'emusa. It's called the bread of emunah. Why does the Zohar call matzah the bread of emunah? It's because the matzah is the symbol of our exodus from slavery in Egypt to freedom as servants of one God. In other words, we go out from servitude to flesh and blood to servitude to the Almighty. And what's more, the whole story of Passover is one big story of Emunah. It divides logic. Emunah divides logic. Where logic leaves off, that's where Emunah begins. And many things we're about to learn tonight and in the coming 2 weeks, they sound like outright exaggerations to the 21st century logical mind. But once again, Emunah is beyond logic. And our entire history defies logic. If someone knew what the reality in Egypt, there was no way that one slave could make it out of Egypt, much less a nation of millions. Okay, so our entire history defines logic, and can rest assured that every single fact that we're learning today, in this lesson, it took a long time preparing, every single fact is backed up by Torah sources, oral Torah sources, written Torah sources, and nothing is made up in storybooks. It's all handed down to us from parent to child, from teacher to pupil, for the last 3,335 years since we left Egypt. Okay, that's the difference between the Jewish people of Israel, and everyone else. People they hear this old stories. We have an unbroken chain where the Torah is passed down, the story of Egypt is passed down. We remember it every day, and it's a mitzvah. We remind ourselves every day when we leave Egypt. And we remind ourselves of the exodus of Egypt in so many different mitzvahs. Zecher l'tziat Mitzrayim. This reminder that we leave in Egypt. Reminder to leave Egypt. We remind ourselves of slavery in Egypt. We put on tefillin. We remind ourselves during Shabbat all the time, because it's important never to forget that we were slaves, and we'll see the importance of that also. Okay. Now, the story of Passover teaches us three main lessons of Emunah. First, that Hashem is always with us, even in the most hopeless situations, and it looks like we've been cast away. And this is a lesson that people have despair, people have situations they don't think there's going to be a solution. You learn from the story of Passover what Rabbi Nachman of Breslov teaches: Ein shum yeush ba'olam. There's no despair in the world. You've got Emunah. There's no such thing as despair. Okay, even it looks like we've been cast away. It looks like we've been thrown to the dogs. It looks like what it looks like. Okay, the reality is what's going on upstairs, what Hashem is doing. Okay, so the first thing, that Hashem is always with us. That's the first lesson. The second lesson, we learn about Hashem's magnificent precision, divine direction. How Hashem personally directs every single fact, and we see this throughout because He alone is creator of all creation and director of all of creation, and Hashem decides everything Himself. Now, our adversaries, as we'll see, they have all sorts of plans for Israel and for the Israelites. We saw this in Purim, Nafochu, everything turned around. Haman made all types of plans, turned on his head. But Haman, if you would learn the story of Passover, he might have not had such a tragic death. Okay, but Hashem shows that His plans are the ones that manifest, not the plans for enemies. Okay, I'll give you a little example, and it's almost Hashem's got a sense of humor. Who would Pharaoh believe that the foster son that he raises on his knees, he threw all these babies into the Nile, as we're going to learn, because he was afraid, as his soothsayers told him, that today is going to be a man-child is going to overthrow you. So he threw all these babies into the Nile. Meanwhile, that the person that overthrows him is his foster son he's raising on his knee. That's little Moses. Okay, this is Hashem's divine direction. It turns out the most unlikely, the most supernatural. This to Hashem, and this is the realm of Emunah. It's the supernatural. But this is, for us, is natural. When we live lives of Emunah, that the supernatural is natural. Okay, so Pharaoh would never believe it, but that's what happened. He raised the leader of the Jews on his own lap. And that's just one example. We're going to learn a lot more. Our third lesson of Emunah, that we learn the story of Passover, that Hashem runs the world in a measure for measure fashion. We see everything. We'll see this especially next week in the 10 plagues, how every single plague is measure for measure. The Egyptians did it. It's like cause and effect. It's like a spiritual Newton, cause and effect. Every action has a equal and opposite reaction. When a case of this is someone does evil, okay, Hashem, you want to create evil? Take your evil force right back in your face. And the opposite goes even 500 times stronger. When a person creates a positive force, a good force, he gets it back also 500 times. Okay, so we'll see this principle really coming to play during the 10 plagues, but that's next week. All right. So learning the story of Passover, it not only prepares us for a really meaningful Passover and for a Seder night, but it gives us a big boost in Amunah. It's a wonderful way to learn Amunah. Okay, so let's start with the descent in Egypt. Here are the Israelites, the sons of Jacob. They're still free people, and they go to Egypt. What brought them down to Egypt? Let's ask ourselves something. Hashem gave Abraham the promised land. He took him out of Iraq, Ur Kasdim, where he was born, and he brought him to the promised land, land of Israel. And Abraham had to leave his birthplace. We see in Parshas Lech Lecha. He lived the land of his fathers, the land where he grew up, and he went to a strange land because Hashem said, "This is the land I promise you and your offspring." And now, Hashem takes Abraham out of the promised land right at the beginning and makes him go down to Egypt. Why did Hashem want Abraham to go down to Egypt? Hashem does everything for a purpose. Okay, we see some main reasons. We'd like to look, this has helped understand. It gives us a general understanding before the facts and the basic stories, what's going on behind the scenes. Okay, so we ask ourselves, if Hashem does everything for the best, then why did he exile our forefathers, Abraham, and then later Jacob and the 12 sons? And the 12 sons never came back. They died in Egypt. And from freedom, their offspring became slaves. We're going to see exactly how it happened. Okay, why did all this happen? Well, our sages, we glean the Gemara and the Midrash. Our sages give us 6 predominant reasons that we had to go down in Egypt, and this affects us today. Okay, the first was to prevent assimilation. We saw when Jacob left his father-in-law in Syria, in Padam Aram, and he came back to the land of Israel, Jacob's daughter Dinah was abducted, seduced, tempted, raped, whatever you want to call it, all 4, by Shechem, the son of Hamor, who was a prince of the Chivi tribe, one of the Canaanite tribes, right? And eventually, the Shimon and Levi, as bar mitzvah boys, they went to war on that. So we saw that with the Canaanite tribes, they were attracted by the Israelites. They were in danger. The Israelites were in danger of assimilating in Canaan. And the Canaanites were terrible idolaters, and they had all types of debauchery and things that Hashem didn't want us to learn. Okay, so the Canaanites, they were more than willing to mix with the Israelites. Not so the Egyptians. The Egyptians had a deep disgust for the Israelites because the Israelites, number one, they were shepherds. Number two, they were meat eaters. They ate lamb and mutton. They ate the sheep they grew. And this was the God of Egypt. Egypt worshiped the lamb, the sheep. And they'd say the Israelites are slaughtering their God and eating it. They couldn't stand that. So an Egyptian couldn't stand eating at the same table with an Israelite. So by Hashem sending the Jews during, let's call it their basic training and their advanced training as a nation, by sending them down to Egypt, Hashem saved them from assimilation before they became a full-fledged nation. Because if they had stayed in the land of Israel, there was a chance that they might assimilate. And we see in the writings of Eliyahu Navi, Tanah de Eliyahu, the writing of Elijah the prophet, he teaches us that another advantage of their going down to Egypt was they had to cling to their distinctiveness. They didn't change their language. They didn't speak foreign language. They spoke Hebrew. They didn't change their names. If a guy's name was Abraham, they didn't call him Abi. And if his name was Michael, they didn't call him Mike. And if his name was Rachmiel, they didn't call him Rocky. They kept the original names. And they didn't take on the local form of dress. The women, they kept their modest dress. The men kept their long clothes. And they lived in a neighborhood together. They didn't mix with the Egyptians. Okay, so this distinctiveness that they cling to in Egypt, that they might not have clung to it in the beginning as a nation in the land of Canaan, which was then the land of Israel, this led to their redemption. Okay, so that's the first thing, prevented assimilation. Hashem's second purpose was to enable them to recognize supreme divine sovereignty. Okay, where do you see light most? You see light most in the deepest darkness. Okay, if you see, you light a match in full sunlight, you can't see the match. But if you go in a dark, black room and there's no thing of light, you light one little candle, it's going to create a lot of light. They say that the Lubavitcher Rebbe used to say, a little light chases away a lot of darkness. So light is goodness and darkness is evil. Okay, Egypt was the world's capital of evil, the world's capital of idolatry and witchcraft, and everything was so, witchcraft was so heavy in Egypt, their borders, they didn't have to have troops on their borders because their borders were guarded by demons and witchcraft. So if they had a slave couldn't escape because he'd come to the border and all of a sudden there'd be like that magnetic witchcraft field where he couldn't leave. There was no way that one slave could leave Egypt. So even if a slave would flee his master in Cairo or Alexandria, he couldn't cross the border and eventually be caught and brought back into slavery. So the whole world would ultimately witness how in a country where one slave couldn't leave Egypt, all of a sudden a nation of millions leave Egypt against it, and Pharaoh does everything to fight against them. This was a sanctification of Hashem's name. This enabled the whole world to recognize divine sovereignty. Okay, now the third reason that Hashem wanted him to go down to Egypt, sometimes Hashem wants to give a reward to a person, but the person doesn't outrightly deserve the reward. Hashem gives them a great deed to do, gives them a reward. In other words, Hashem puts them in a situation where they save a life. Now they get a great reward. The opposite also holds true. Sometimes Hashem can't completely throw the book at someone. So now Hashem gives them something evil to do. This is all we have to do. It's all divine direction. Hashem decides what to do, but Hashem enables the good people to be the agents of good and the evil people to be the agents of evil. And the good people get rewarded for doing the good, and the evil people, they get punished for doing the bad. But Hashem doesn't force them to do the good or the bad. This is the free choice. The person decides whether he wants to be an agent of the good or an agent of the bad. Well, Egypt decided it's going to be an agent of bad. Egypt decided that it was going to be the world's capital of debauchery. And that means that there was no promiscuity on earth like there was in Egypt. I can't even begin to describe it and won't describe it. That's not our purpose. There was no country of idolatry like Egypt. Take the biggest voodoo and the biggest idolaters, they didn't come to the ankles of Egypt. And there was no country of witchcraft, like Egypt. Egypt was the thing, plus which Hashem wanted to throw the book at them, so Hashem put the Jews under their control, and Hashem wanted them to suffer a little bit, but the Egyptians made them suffer much, much more. This is Hashem threw the book at them, and we'll see what happened in our third lesson, exactly what happens to Egypt. Okay, what's the fourth reason for Hashem sending us down to Egypt? Hashem wanted to reinforce our spiritual DNA. The fact that our forefathers were in Egypt and our forefathers had to withstand great hardships, this affects our DNA to this day. Now, our sages explained that Abraham can't begin to describe Abraham's lofty level. Abraham was the first Hebrew. Abraham was the first monotheist, but Abraham's father was a big idolater. Not only an idolater, he owned a factory of idols, Terach. Okay. Abraham, he discovered Emunah, but by the power of his cogent mind, is the thinking, and he discovered Hashem in the world, and he did all types of observation till he found Hashem. But even so, according to Abraham's level, Hashem judges a person on their own level. In other words, if you're teaching kindergarten kids gymnastics and they do a somersault, that's fine. That's fine for a kindergarten kid. But for a person in the Olympics, they're not going to get a gold medal for doing a somersault and free exercise on the mat. Okay. At the level of emunah that Hashem expected from Abraham was very high. Because you can remember, Hashem gave Abraham his neshama. Now, on Abraham's level, again, on Abraham's level, you have to understand, when I'm talking about a blemish and emunah of Abraham, Abraham's blemish emunah was higher than the biggest tzaddiks emunah today. But on Abraham's level, he had several blemishes in emunah. And these are not words, these words come from the Ramban, but they're not the words of the Ramban Arisha. I couldn't say them. This is everything we say here. It's that I don't mention the sources during the lesson because this would really bog down the lesson. Okay, but it's all got a source. What was Abraham's blemish in emunah? When there was a famine in the land of Israel, Abraham should have trusted in Hashem that he's not going to go hungry. But Abraham went down to Egypt in search of food. Okay, now went down to Egypt. He should have trusted Hashem again that Hashem will protect him and protect his wife, Sarah. But Abraham was worried that Sarah was so beautiful and Egyptians were so full of lust and promiscuity that they would abduct her and maybe even kill him. So Abraham said, it's my sister. He didn't say it's his wife. Okay, and then he says, well, that's like a half-truth because his wife was actually his niece. All right, it's a niece, it's the brother's daughter. The brother's daughter, that's like a sister. Okay, but he should have trusted Hashem because what he did and what Hashem was upset about, he put Sarah in great danger. Sarah would never contradict her husband. So when he said, she's my sister, she didn't say a word. And when they took her to Pharaoh, she didn't say a word. But then Pharaoh and his family were afflicted with all types of with pains and diseases, where they discovered that Hashem came to him in a dream at night, and he said, that young lady in your house, she's a married woman, and if you keep her there, you're going to be in worse shape than you are now. And so right away, not only released her, but he paid all types of hush money to Abraham. And then Abraham, that's why Abraham left with riches. So Abraham shouldn't have exposed her to that danger. All right. And third, when Hashem said to Abraham, Abraham didn't yet have children. He says, I'm going to give you the land of Israel for your offspring. Abraham said to Hashem, B'meidah. So I'm going to know. I don't have kids. What's the proof? He asked Hashem for proof. Ooh, okay. Because he asked Hashem for proof, then it was decreed that his offspring would be slaves in Egypt, right? And we see every one of these things, as we'll see later, how it was all measure for measure. Okay, so this is all to put us in Egypt, put us under heavy test, and this enforces our spiritual DNA. Okay, the fifth is to show that the deeds of fathers and mothers are stepping stones for sons and daughters. They follow in the footpaths of parents. For example, Sarah was abducted on Passover Eve, and Hashem sent an angel to afflict the Egyptians. And that's the same night where Hashem later would send the angel of death to afflict the Egyptians' firstborn. And then Sarah was released the next day, Passover day, in the morning, and that's exactly when the Jews were released from Egypt. You see, one thing, we go and the facts, take every tiny fact and trace it to its source. It's all measure for measure for measure. So the same thing happened to Sarah's offspring. Abraham left Egypt with great riches, and his offspring would ultimately leave Egypt with also great riches, the spoils from Egypt. Okay, so our sixth lesson is to spiritually and morally toughen the Jewish people, that you don't get spiritually and morally tough from watching the telly and eating chocolate ice cream. Hashem knew that for the Jews to receive the Torah, that they would have to withstand opposition from the entire world, that the entire world would go against them, because the evil inclination would mobilize the entire world to go against the Jews. So therefore, there were indescribable hardships they had to endure during the subsequent generation of slavery in Egypt, and that would prepare them to be servants of Hashem and live by it despite indescribable hardships that there would be. Hashem knew on the way to Mashiach, on the way to Gula, going through Inquisition and Holocaust and Not everyone held on to their faith, but really the ones with the real 24-karat neshamas, the Israelite neshamas, they hold on to it, right? So how did the slavery start in the beginning? Okay, there was a threat to Egypt. Have to remember that Jacob and his family were a mere 70 people when they descended to Egypt. And out of the 70 people, 16 of them, they were past childbearing age. So only 54 were still in childbearing age. So in the course of a 210-year exile, they multiplied at a supernatural pace. When they left Egypt, and I'm giving the smallest number, this is the smallest number. When they left Egypt, there were 600,000 men over the age of 20. And there are commentators that say a zero is missing. It's 6 million men only. And there were, with women and children, according to the conservative figure, the lowest figure, there were 3 million altogether. 3 million altogether. Now, since only 20% left Egypt, and that means 80% died during the darkness, that means that there were the 3 million out of a population of 15 million. There were 15 million. This again, according to the conservative estimate and the Gemara and the Midrash. So we see that in a matter of 210 years, 70 people became 15 million. And there's one opinion that says 150 million. And what happened is just that they were very, Hashem gave them tremendous fertility. And every time a woman gave birth, it was sextuplets. She had 6 in one time, not twins, not triplets, but sextuplets. Okay, so what did Pharaoh do? Pharaoh felt threatened. Pharaoh says all these Jews and Jews and Jews and Jews. He says, what? They're swarming. They're multiplying uncontrollably, and they're going to take over my country. So Pharaoh thought of a way to set a trap for them and to disarm them. And we have to understand this is amazing what the slave mentality does. There's something else. The Gemara says that the Jews are fiercest of fighters. And we see how fierce fighters they were in the Torah. We mentioned Shimon and Levi. Shimon and Levi, as bar mitzvah boys, they wiped out an entire Canaanite town that abducted their sister. And we look at the Malbim in Parshas Vayechi, and he talks about what great fighters each one of them were. Okay, all of a sudden, what happened to their great fighting arts? The Israeli fighting arts. All of a sudden, they're weak, and one Egyptian taskmaster could control 500 Israelis. We see this. We see this as a curse in the Torah in the end, that if one does Shem's will, then one Israelite will chase 1,000 enemy. And when it's the opposite, then one enemy can control 1,000. And you see this prophecy come true in Egypt. You see this prophecy come true in the Holocaust. You see pictures of the Holocaust where you've got cattle cars on the way to concentration camps. And in front of one cattle car, you've got one German with a carbine, he's guarding a whole cattle car. Oh, wait a second. Okay, guys, let's get together. And we've got to fight a thing. All right, let's say there's 250 of us jammed in a cattle car. So we're going to rush this guy. He's got in his clip. He's only got 8 rounds in his clip. This is a World War II clip. Okay, and let's say maybe if Hashem has pity on us and his gun jammed. Okay, so we jump on him, and maybe 4 or 5 of us get lost, but then we save 245 of us. No, to do quietly. Where's this fighting spirit? What's going on? And we see this in Egypt. We see what happens to that in Egypt. So Pharaoh, what he did, and what took away the fighting spirit, is that people think that when the Jews, they learn Torah, they're weak. It's the exact opposite. When they go into political correctness and they try to assimilate, an assimilated Jew loses his character as an Israelite. He loses his courage, he loses his emunah, and he becomes like the local, but he can't be like the local. So he's a double loser. He can't be like the local. He can't be like the German, the Russian, the Swiss, the Egyptian, the Tunisian, the Moroccan. Okay, and he's not being a Jew. So he has not Torah, and then he loses his fierceness. And it's easily enslaved, as we see in the diaspora. That's one of the curses of diaspora. Okay, so the slavery trap, as long as Jacob was still alive, the Jews were treated with kindness. because Pharaoh knew that that terrible famine was supposed to last for 7 years. It only lasted for 2 years, thanks to Jacob. But this golden period, it only lasted for 17 years. Jacob was alive for 17 years in Egypt. All right, now things get a little bit worse, but they're not yet slavery. As soon as Jacob died, there was a subtle downgrading of Israel's status. Where do we see this? Jacob was Joseph, who was the viceroy of Egypt, and Joseph, who he made the economic plan to save Egypt from starvation and from economic deprivation. Not Pharaoh, was Joseph. But Joseph, to go from Egypt to bury his father in the land of Israel in Hebron, he has to ask Pharaoh for permission. Pharaoh, may I go? And Pharaoh says, yeah, you could go, but your family stays here. He had to leave his family behind, his sons behind, his property behind, had everything behind for collateral. But he had to go. And he had like a little boy. He had to go and ask permission. Imagine that the vice president of the United States, he has to ask somebody for permission before he takes a trip to Europe. He gets on a plane, he goes. This is a Joseph, and this is his father's funeral. He has to bury his father in the family burial plot in Hebron, in the land of Israel. He has to ask Pharaoh. So we see things go slightly down. Okay, now Joseph died 71 years after the Israelites ascended to Egypt. Okay, 71 years later. And once Joseph died, Israel lost its prestige. But they were not quite in slavery yet. They lost their prestige because Joseph wasn't there, Jacob wasn't there. There was still one brother alive, Levi, and Levi was the last of the 12 sons of Jacob to die, and Levi died 94 years after the descent to Egypt. After Levi died, they became total slaves. As long as there was one of Jacob's sons alive, they didn't fall into slavery. All right, now let's look at what it's see how this is still alive today, that the whole thing of slavery was a war. It was even within the Jewish people, a war between Torah and political correctness. Okay, the Midrash and Parshas Shmos, it says that servitude began when Pharaoh played a trick on the unsuspecting Israelites. They wanted to find favor in Pharaoh's eyes. Yeah, we're fine. We're upright. We're good, loyal Egyptian citizens. So Pharaoh knew this. So what did he do? He dressed in his royal clothes, and he says, we've got to develop the country. We've got to develop the country. Look at all this barren desert. We've got to build 2 new cities, Pitom and Ramses. Okay, so the Pitom and Ramses. And you know something? I believe in these 2 development cities, and let's go. We took his workers and took the Jews. Come on, let's go. Pharaoh was in his royal clothes, and Pharaoh starts mixing mortar and playing with cement and making bricks. And, if you're politically correct and you see the king doing this, you're not going to join in. You want to find favor in the king's eyes. Okay, so the Jews right away joined in. This is wonderful. You're helping me, Pharaoh says to them. Okay, but the political correctness of the Israelites, they wanted to find favor in Pharaoh's eyes. Pharaoh says, you know something? You're not going to work for free. I'm going to give you a good wage. So really go for it. And Pharaoh worked as hard. One day he worked really hard, and the Jews, they worked like crazy. And each one of them made 400 bricks that day. And Pharaoh gave him a good wage. Okay, the next day, they said, we see the Jews are capable of 400 bricks. This is your quota. So the next day they came back, and the salary was cut in half. And they said, well, why is salary cut in half? No, that was in honor of the king. He was with us. The king's not with us today. And then every day cut in half, where it is within a short period, it was slave labor. And then the slave labor turned into outright slavery. And they couldn't do it. So what do we learn? The Midrash tells us, and this is an acronym. We say hard labor is called befarech, but we take the letters befarech and we separate them beferach. It comes with a sweet tongue. So Pharaoh took his sweet tongue and turned that into hard labor on the rock pile. 11 out of the 12 tribes fell into that trap. One tribe did not fall into that trap. That was the Levites. And I said, what are you guys doing? You crazy? You crazy? You're going to work in the house, son? What about Torah? No. What about this? This is before Torah, but they had the books that Abraham wrote, and Abraham, his teachings, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They had the teachings that they would sit and learn. And this to them was the Torah then, was before the official Torah that they got on Mount Sinai. And they said, what's this is, we're light unto the nations. We should be the spiritual light. What are you going and trying to find favor in a Pharaoh? Look what's that. No, this is the same argument that we learned in the story of Purim, that Mordechai didn't want the Jews to participate in Achashverosh's feast. Okay. Moses, he didn't want, he wouldn't have wanted the Jews to participate in Pharaoh, even though Moses wasn't brought up in Pharaoh and Moses was not born yet. But as a leader, he wouldn't have wanted that. We'll see later how Moses is going to react to things like this. He wouldn't have wanted that. But political correctness wins over the highbrows. Oh, no, you Torah learners. And the highbrows had their way. And the highbrows put the whole country, 11 out of 12 tribes, into slavery. Right? But Levi didn't follow that. They already had declared themselves as servants of Shem. We're not servants of humans. And they arranged their own study halls in their separate land of Goshen. They lived separately. Goshen is an area in the northeast of Egypt. It's about 100 miles north of the of Lake Suez, and it's land with a lot of grazing. It's good. It was good for the sheep. It's because it's near the Nile, and they have water there. So that's where the Jews live separately. Alexandria is on the coast. Cairo is more inside. Cairo is where the pyramids are. That's more in the center of Egypt. Okay, so they lived Goshen. They had absolute loyalty to Hashem, and they despised political correctness. The only correctness they had was divine correctness. Okay, now, Rabbi Eliyahu Dessler, Michtam Eliyahu, he notes that Joseph had a key role in protecting the Levites from enslavement. There's only got Joseph deserves credit for that. Because when Joseph was viceroy of Egypt, he could have enslaved the Egyptian priests. But he figured he was very brilliant. He said to Pharaoh, he says, I'm not going to slave the priests. I'm going to give them free bread and let them have their reign. So therefore, Pharaoh couldn't turn around and enslave the Israelite priests. And Levites, the priestly tribe. So Joseph created a loophole that helped the Levites avoid slavery. And something very interesting to note, that the Levites, they were not slaves, but they multiplied at less than half the rate of the smallest tribe. We see that the more the Jews suffered and the more the Jews were suffered the slavery, they multiplied more. But the Levites, they were smallest tribe. Okay. So ultimately, we say we're 210 years in Egypt. We deduct the 94 years until Levi died. So it was actually 116 years of really hard labor. Now, the worst years was the last 86. What do our stepping stones? The worst year, the last 86. The really difficult slavery started when Miriam died. When Miriam was born. Miriam, the daughter of Yocheved and Amram, she's the older sister. She's 6 years older than Moses. And this was 86 years ago, 86 years before the exodus of Egypt. These were the really difficult suffering years of slavery. Okay, it was made worse by the assimilationists. The highbrows, they haven't learned their lesson yet. They're still assimilating. And they still think that if they assimilate and they act like the Egyptians, and they adopt the Egyptians' idols, then life is going to be easier on them. No, Hashem would have made it harder. Because all the time they're assimilating more and more and more and more. And you can see with the observant, even like today, observant Israelites, there were no more than 20% back then. And we see 20% left Egypt. 20%, 80% stayed behind, 80% did not. Why did they stay behind? They did not believe in the Geula. They didn't believe in Hashem, didn't believe in redemption of Hashem, didn't believe in the land of Israel. And we're talking about, we said, if 3 million got out, that means that 12 million left behind. So if you're talking about, and this is the smallest number, smallest estimate. So if you're talking about the Holocaust, 6 million, and in Egypt, 12 million died. So we ask ourselves a question. Wait a second. How come Seder night we're so happy? You heard the music before we started the lesson. And we're singing Seder in our best clothes, and it's Holocaust night. The Holocaust in Germany was 6 million. Here was 12 million. How come we're so happy? We don't cry about people that deny the redemption, deny Hashem, and they want to assimilate. That we don't cry about that. And that's why Pesach is a very happy night, because it's our redemption out of Egypt. All of us, we are the descendants of those redeemed. And so you could see, but in a way, it was a Holocaust. They died. We'll learn this next week, that during the 3 days of darkness, that all the highbrows and all the doubters and all the agnostics and all, they all bye-bye. They didn't make it out. They didn't make it out. And Hashem let them die in the darkness that the Egyptians wouldn't see, that the Egyptians couldn't rejoice. Oh, the Jews are dying too. Okay, but as it was, and this is what the Torah, Rashi, this is right in the Torah, it's written right in the Torah, Hamushim, Yatsu, Meretz Mitzrayim, 1 out of 5 left Eretz Yisrael, and the Gemara says it's 1 out of 50. But I'm using the most conservative numbers. If it's 1 out of 50, that means that we were 150 million people, not 15 million people. And it means that not 12 million people were left behind, 120 million people were left behind. Okay, but again, stick to the verified, most conservative figures. All right, so let's talk about the suffering of slavery. Talk about all and how we became slaves and the climate behind. Now, in review of the Torah's account, old Pharaoh, he died. Old Pharaoh died. Now we got a new Pharaoh. A new Pharaoh gains the throne. And he had no sympathy or love for the children of Israel. V'lo yadat Yosef. And he chose to forget or ignore everything that Jacob and Joseph had done for Egypt. So he decided to take action against the growing influence and growing numbers of children of Israel. And he called his council together. And they advised him to enslave the people and to oppress them before they became too powerful. All right. And they were able, but despite these great numbers, in other words, if they had retained their emunah and retained their connection to Hashem, like their ancestors, like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the tribal heads, the 12 sons, as long as they retained that, they were fierce. But now they were sheepish because their political correctness and their bad kowtowing to the local rulers. So, as we mentioned, slavery began in stages. It began first of all, Pharaoh talked nice to them. Then he limited their personal freedom. Then he put taxes on them. Then he recruited the men in the forced labor battalions, and they were still getting paid something. And then he took away the pay. Then he put harsh taskmasters, and the children of Israel had to build cities and erect monuments and construct roads and work in quarries and hew stones and make bricks and tiles. But the more the Egyptians oppressed them, the harder the restrictions imposed on them became, the more the children of Israel increased and multiplied. It's unnatural, despite the hard work. And Pharaoh did everything that the slaves couldn't even go home at night. They had to sleep out in the field or sleep on a construction site. It's still, Hashem enabled them, had Hashem miracles. Okay, so finally, when the king Pharaoh saw that forcing the Hebrews to do hard work, it didn't succeed in suppressing their rapidly growing numbers, he decided that, okay, all new male children get thrown into the Nile. All right. And all Hebrews don't know that only the daughters be permitted to live. And they figured, okay, the daughters would be okay for Egyptian men. And that's it. And then no more Jewish people. This was Pharaoh's plan. So Pharaoh hoped to end the numerical increase of the Jewish population. At the same time, to eliminate what he viewed as a security danger. And according to the predilections of his astrologers, his own life, Pharaoh's own life, was threatened by this child that was about to be born to the Jews. Now, as time goes on, suffering just gets worse and worse and worse. With every day that goes by, suffering of the slaves, the Jewish people in Egypt is it's just worse. Now, by the time, we'll see in the third lesson, when Israel leaves Egypt, you could barely find a man or woman that wasn't missing a hand, wasn't missing a finger, wasn't missing an eye, didn't have his ears blown out, or lost his hearing, was limp, lame. They were all blemished. the slavery. It's just most of them were injured and wounded, like war veterans. Okay, so worse than the suffering of their own bodies, the suffering of their own bodies was terrible, unspeakable. But there was something worse than that. Forced to watch their newborn sons being thrown into the Nile. Can you imagine that you just give birth, or your wife just gives birth, an Egyptian taskmaster runs in, there's no hospital room, but it was like Soviet Russia. There, all the Egyptians saying, oh, this one's pregnant, this one's pregnant. They would write it down and they would estimate, though, she's about 3 months or 4 months or 5 months, and they'd keep a list of it. And then they'd go back and they'd visit her at the time that right before she give birth in the 8th month, and what's the situation. And then the 9th month, she'd get visited every day until they finally hear a baby crying. And that's it. They come in, Egyptian soldiers, take that baby away from a screaming mother that they just gave birth. And not only does she have to watch her child be thrown into the Nile. Nile is full of alligators. Watching these alligators come up and devour it can't even. I can't even tell. I've got it written down in the lesson, but it's difficult to tell. Difficult to tell the atrocities that they saw, just the scavengers in the Nile, and it got so bad. Talk about atrocities. I don't think anywhere in history there were atrocities like the atrocities of slavery in Egypt. Nowhere, not Chinese atrocity, Chinese torture, not even Nazi atrocities, like gas chambers. Egypt was much, much worse. It was so bad that the Nile was so full of corpses of Jewish babies that started to stink, that the alligators and the fish, that they couldn't finish all of it. So they sent Jewish men in to scrape up the corpses and to turn them into mortar for the pyramids. You see that pyramid there? If you look in the pyramids and you would do DNA in the pyramids, you'd find every single pyramid, every single layer, everything brick, find Jewish kids. That's all. It's full of it, because that's the mortar there. It's unspeakable. And take the bricks. Egyptians, they were unsurpassed with their atrocities. And every day they tried to dream of new atrocities. So the Israelites, we mentioned that they had a quota from the first day where they willfully made bricks. They made them keep that quota every day of the 400 bricks. But then, no, that's it. At the beginning, they provided them, here's the clay, here's the straw. You mix the bricks, you put them in the kiln, in the oven, you bring them out, this and that. Do the 400 bricks, okay? But then they took away the clay. Well, clay digging, it's backbreaking, especially Egyptian clay. It's porous and it's really sticky and it's terrible. It's really difficult to work in. It's backbreaking work. And they had to dig their own clay, but the quota stayed the same. That wasn't enough. Then they took away the straw. Okay, then they had to get straw. Egypt is not, it's not Kansas or South Wales, where the sheep are grazing. It's Egypt. It's a barren desert country. You got to go all over the place for a little bit of straw to get a little bit of straw. But they took the straw away, and once again, you're not in the lowlands of Scotland. You're in Egypt. Okay, you can't find straw there. All right, but a Jew could go and all this walking and have to run back and still make the 400 thing. Atrocities aren't over. When a Jew would faint or lose consciousness from work and not enough water and not enough food, okay, that's fine. Hitler had his ovens, his gas chambers. Egypt, go into the mortar, take the body, throw it into the mortar, turns it to mortar, build the pyramids. That's it. And so Jewish bodies were crushed. They don't even know an estimate. Thousands every day. So when I talk about, so who enforced all this? Pharaoh's taskmasters. If you learn in modern literature, in American literature, we're in university, we learned American literature, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And there was this character called Simon Legree. And Simon Legree is like a archetype of a taskmaster. Compare Simon Legree to an Egyptian taskmaster, and he's like a big bird out of Sesame Street. That's what he is, nothing more. When a Jew would fail to fulfill his quota, and they almost failed every day, okay, what was the Jew's penalty for failing to fulfill? Okay, the taskmaster would send a platoon of soldiers to his house. Okay, and it was, where's Yanka's kids? So take one of his kids. Okay, take one of the kids. Okay, didn't make enough bricks. All right, your kid will become a brick. And they threw the live kid into the mortar and crushed him and into the pyramids. That's it. That was in the beginning, but that wasn't good enough. Ultimately, when a Jew, would they do that for missing his quota? But they said when they weren't working enough, for every brick he missed, they'd take a child. In other words, if a 390 bricks instead of 400 bricks, they take 10 children. And this was unspeakable, unthinkable, unbelievable, worst nightmare task. And right before, Hashem said, we'll see, we can take a quick overview of Moses, where Moses was all this time. By the time Hashem sent Moses back to Egypt with the message of let my people go, the Egyptian taskmasters were killing the Jewish kids right and left by the millions. Okay, so don't think that the kiddies spent their time in kindergarten and playing Lego. No, but the kiddies too had to labor in the hot sun. Now you take a child, a 7-year-old child, and put him to work on a rock pile and making bricks, building the pyramids. An Egyptian sun, against the Egyptian sun. This is not Minneapolis sun, and then not Oregon sun. This is Egypt. It's hot. It's very hot. Okay. And a kid faints, or he falls down. And if he'd fall down in this Egyptian clay and couldn't get up, okay, a very quick solution. This was the Egyptian gas chambers, was the mortar. Become part of the mortar, become part of the concrete. And this is why people, they want to marvel to see to me, I never had a desire to go and see the pyramids. It's like to Auschwitz. It's like going to Auschwitz. It's the same thing, right? So we mentioned that Jewish mothers would normally give birth to sextuplets. So imagine the life of a Jewish mother. Okay, if she gave birth once, she had 6 kids at home. If she gave birth 3 times, she had 18 kids at home. Now she gave birth again. Okay, so now she's got these 6 crying babies she's got to feed. She's got 18 kids at home she's got to feed. No, the taskmaster, she gave birth. Come on, back to the rock pile. She had to go right back from giving birth to slavery. She was still in slavery. And so what happened to save their lives and save their babies, many of the Israelite women, they would go out in the field, way out in the field to give birth. And this is when Pharaoh, the Torah talks, when Pharaoh chastises Miriam, this is Miriam Yocheved. They're called, they also had the names Pua and Shifra, the midwives. This is the mother-daughter midwives. And this was Moses' sister and his mother. And he asked, why did you leave the babies alive? And they say, well, the Jewish women, they're not like the Egyptian women, they need a midwife. The Jewish women are like animals in the field. They go out in the field and they give birth. Okay, and it wasn't a lie, it was true. That's what they do to keep the kids alive. Okay, so we see that that's what they had to do to keep their kids alive. So imagine mother going through the pain of childbirth and the emotional, carrying children for 9 months, and then Egyptian taskmaster drowning her newborns, kicking her back to work. Can't even begin to think of it. It gets unthinkable. All right, let's leave the atrocities and let's go on to Moses. All right, Moses was born 6 years after Miriam. When Moses was born, the slavery really began getting its worst. Moses' mother, who was a Levite, she was not a slave because she was a Levite. His father was a Levite, Amram, his mother Yocheved. They were Levites, they were not slaves, but they were subject to the same decree of throwing their children into the Nile. Now, Yocheved gave birth to Moses, and she succeeded in hiding him for 9 months. But when he got big enough and he started crying loud enough, she couldn't hide him anymore. So what she did, she built a little straw ark, and she strengthened it, what's called kofar in Hebrew. It's like a type of pitch, and make it waterproof. And she put the baby in it and put him in the Nile. And then she told her daughter, Miriam, to hide in the reeds and follow what's going on. So now we see Hashem's wonderful divine direction. Pharaoh's daughter was named Batya. Pharaoh had a very upright daughter. She was disgusted by her father's cruelty. Now, what her father used to do, her father had leprosy. And the Egyptian soothsayers told him that he would cure his leprosy if he made a bath full of the blood of Jewish babies. So they would slaughter 400 Jewish babies and fill the bathtub, and that's what Pharaoh would bathe in the blood of Jewish babies. So the soothsayers were right, because Hashem, in order to save the lives of Jewish babies, let Pharaoh be cured of his leprosy so he wouldn't do this again. All right. But meanwhile, Batya, she wanted to richly purify herself. The Nile is a kosher mikveh. She wanted to purify herself from the idolatry of Egypt. And she really had great respect for the Jewish people. She wanted to cling to their God. So she went to the Nile to do a immersion for purification immersion and a conversion immersion. Artasis tells us that she became Jewish right then. Ultimately, Batya will leave Egypt with the Jewish people, and she became the wife of Kalev ben Yefunah. He married her. Remember, Kalev and Yoshua are the two spies that go into Jericho. Okay, so Batya became his wife. Batya, she's about a teenager right now. Moses is a baby, 9-month-old baby. Batya is maybe 16, 17. She doesn't have children. And she sees this baby in a little raft in the Nile. And she knows it's an Israelite baby. And she looks at it, she opens the blanket, and she sees a divine light. She sees a divine light, Hashem, the divine presence. And she right away recognized this is a holy baby. And she says, I got to take this baby. I'm going to raise this baby. And she took this baby, and right away, Miriam appeared from the reeds. And she says, do you know of a Hebrew midwife? She says, sure do, her mother. She says, go get me a midwife. I'll pay her for it. So she goes and gets Moses' mother to nurse him. And then Moses' mother, under Pharaoh's nose, not only nurses Pharaoh's foster son, but gets paid for it. Okay, so now Moses then gets thrown into the Nile, but you get nursed and he grows. And when he's weaned, he's brought up and he's raised in Pharaoh's court. Now, Pharaoh's advisors were very wary of Moses, and they knew that he was a Hebrew child that Batya adopted. And they said, Your Majesty, this little boy is he's going to overthrow you one day. And he says, no, he's not. This is my son, just like my foster son. I love him. And no, we'll see. So they made a test. You know that Moses stuttered. We'll see later that Aaron, Moses' brother, Aaron, who was 3 years older than Moses, first it was Miriam was born. Then 3 years later, Aaron was born. Then 3 years later, Moses was born. These were Amram and Yochevet's 3 children, Miriam, Aaron, and Moses. So Aaron became the spokesman for Moses because Moses stuttered. How did Moses stutter? When he was a little boy, they tested him. The soothsayers in Egypt made a test, and they put a plate of gold coins and a plate of hot coals. And they said that Pharaoh, put Moses in your lap. If he reaches for the gold coins, then that means he's going to overthrow you. And if he reaches for the hot coals, that means he's loyal to you. Well, what little boy is going to reach for the hot coals? He's wants the gold money. But Hashem sent the angel Gabriel, and angel Gabriel right away moved Moses' hand. Not only did he pick up a hot coal, he touched his tongue with it. Okay, so Pharaoh says, oh, this child's certainly loyal to me. So Pharaoh had no doubt about Moses. All right, but Moses burned his tongue, and he burned his tongue very badly. And then that's how he stuttered for the rest of his life. Okay, but now Moses grows up in the castle, and Moses knows he's a Jew. And one day Moses hears about all this anguish, and he wanted to see it with his own eyes. So one day he went out to the building site, went out to the pyramids, and he saw an Egyptian taskmaster beating the daylights of a Jew. And he looked around, and he didn't see anyone. And see, Moses, he still had the prowess, the fighting prowess of his great-grandfather Levi. Remember, Levi and Shimon together, they, as bar mitzvah boys, they finished off a Canaanite town. Okay. Moses, there's two accounts in the Midrash. Once was he used Hashem's name to put this Egyptian to sleep. Another thing was just one shot to the solar plexus, and the Egyptian was finished. He buried the Egyptians in the sand, and he left. The next day, Moses went out again, and Moses saw two Jews fighting. And he says, why are you fighting? He called them, but you're evil, just because they were threatening each other. They were two brothers, Dathan and Abiram. And so they said to him, what, are you going to kill us like you killed the Egyptian? Uh-oh, Moses knew that the secret was out. If they know, then it's going to get back to Pharaoh very quick. So Moses left, had to flee Egypt. There's one lesson that he actually was caught, and they tried to hit him in the neck with the sword, but Hashem made his neck like marble. That's another, there's all different accounts, but Moses left Egypt. We now see Moses living in Egypt. There's a midrash said became king of Africa. He spent time in Africa, and after he was king of Africa, Moses had 60 years. We have 60 years that we don't know exactly what Moses did, but we do know that he came back to Midian. Midian is like southeast Sinai, towards Saudi Arabia, the side of Saudi Arabia. And that's where Jethro lived. And Moses, he saw that Jethro's daughters, they were being denied water when they tried to flocks. Jethro didn't have sons. And the reason is that Jethro was ostracized by the locals because Jethro was an advisor to Pharaoh, and he left idolatry, left everything, left all idolatry. He was the world's greatest authority in comparative religion, and he left all the idolatry. And he met Moses, and he saw Moses. He knew that Moses was the real deal, and Moses married his daughter. So now Moses is spending his time as Jethro's son-in-law, taking care of Jethro's flocks. And Moses is in Midian, tending Jethro's flocks. And Moses, they love to be Jew. They love to be shepherds, because if you're a shepherd, you're out in the field, you do ipolut all day long. Moses would talk to Hashem all day long. Until one day, Moses is out in the field, he sees this burning bush. It's called in Hebrew a rotem. It's like a burning bristle bush, and it not extinguished. Usually a burning bush in the desert extinguished right away. He goes up, and Hashem reveals himself to Moses in the burning bush. And then Hashem tells Moses, I want you to go down to Egypt and tell Pharaoh to let my people go. And Hashem assures him that it's safe for him to go to Egypt. And Moses is so humble, and he argues with Hashem. He argues with Hashem. He says, I can't, but who am I? Who am I to the Jewish people? But Hashem ultimately convinces him. Moses returns to Egypt. Moses returns to Egypt, and he tells Pharaoh, let my people go. With this, we're going to stop lesson 1. We'll continue Moses' descent to Egypt and the 10 plagues next week, B'ezrat Hashem. Okay, but I want to conclude tonight's lesson with what we say in the Haggadah on Passover night. Now, this is going to be so much more meaningful. We say in the Passover night, Avadim hayinu leparo b'Mitzrayim. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and the Lord our God took us out from there with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. And if the Holy One, blessed be He, had not taken our fathers out of Egypt, then we, our children, our children's children, would have remained a slave to Pharaoh in Egypt. Even if all of us were wise, all of us understanding, all of us knowing the Torah, we would still be obligated to discuss the exodus from Egypt, and everyone who discusses the exodus from Egypt at length is praiseworthy. So, Baruch Hashem, we've given a lot of material that we can discuss the exodus from Egypt. Why do we say we would still be slaves? Why? Okay, how could the Haggadah say we'd still be slaves in Egypt? Because people today are making the same mistakes. Come to Israel, and you can see it. You can see it in the UK, and you can see it in the United States. People are making the same mistakes. Rather than following the role of the Levites that are become servants of Hashem, oh no, they want to be servants to flesh and blood, to Tories, to conservatives, to Democrats, to Republicans, to be liberal New York Times and DBS and all kinds of stuff. Passover reminds us that by subjugating ourselves to the service of Hashem, subjugating ourselves to emunah. This is the only true freedom in the world. So, beloved brothers and sisters, this is not lessons about emunah. This lesson is about freedom. Everything we're learning about, it's all less about freedom. In truth, there's no other true freedom. And with knowing this, we shall have every blessing in life and true happiness. And God willing, hope to see you next week.